Welcome to the ADM podcast, where we talk property acquisition, development, management, and everything in between. Useful strategies, guidance, and compliance best practices for UK landlords with a sprinkle of personal development along the way. Hope you enjoy, subscribe, and share. Today we're going to talk about setting up a new tenancy. So generally, once you're a well-established landlord, you probably would have gone through this process hundreds of times, and it does become kind of second nature. However, it is worth, as sometimes as a refresh, just making sure we're across the compliant way of doing things. There may also be a few nitbits in here which can help you optimize your process. Obviously, for first-time landlords or people that are aspiring to get into the property investment and landlord game, then this may be a useful introduction to the sorts of things that you need to be considering when setting up a new tenancy. So the first thing is to have a compliant tenancy agreement in place. Now there are umpteen different resources and locations that you can find templates that you can essentially copy and paste. I definitely recommend the NRLA. In general, I recommend them become a member and make sure you're leveraging those resources. And just being part of the NRLA community is very useful as well. But yeah, great template on there which you can customize and brand yourself if you feel so inclined, or at least just literally use the template they have. To make the process super streamlined, I like to link the document to my DocuSign account so I can capture digital signatures. This is not necessarily mandatory if you're a landlord that likes to be hands-on and deal with paper copies. Then, of course, proceed with that. Make sure you take your printed copies and get yourself and your tenants a copy each, which are both signed. I definitely think, especially if you want to be a remote hands-off landlord, that DocuSign and software similar to that, where you can create signatures remotely, is super useful. So the second thing really around the tenancy being set up for your new tenant is the right to rent. So make sure the tenant is suitable to be rented to. So this predominantly means making sure that you check their passport. If they're British citizen, make sure it's valid and it seems authentic. Now again, there are software and providers you can use to do this. I think just use general common sense as well. You haven't got to ship a load of money out to umpteen different outsource providers, as I say, to do this. However, if that's what makes you comfortable, yeah, you can. If they are not British, then there is a process that you can apply for via the Gov UK website. So actually, the tenant will go through the process, and what they essentially do is share a code with you, which doesn't give away any personal information, but essentially confirms that they have the right to rent. And I'm assuming this is associated to their immigration status and or visa status. So, you can ask tenants that are not from the UK or British citizens, so I say, to go through this process. And again, it's just something they can Google on the gov.uk website. Um, Alternatively, they can provide you obviously with the original immigration documents, but I would suggest, definitely get it approved by gov.uk as opposed to becoming an immigration expert. Next part really is around your own personal tenant checks and references. So there is not a golden standard necessarily in terms of exactly what you need to check. Again, you can outsource this to external providers, but generally the process is pretty straightforward. And if you want to save on costs, or if you're dealing with volumes of tenancies, then potentially just managing yourself may be easier. So ultimately, you want to look for references. So this will be from a previous landlord, previous employer, or if they're a student, you might want to ask the university and/or college. So I think a general trend that I'm seeing is, or I'm looking to apply, should I say, is to be asking for multiple periods of references. So, for example, if you ask for the last two landlords, if you ask for the last two employers, if you ask for the last two education location providers, be that university or college, I think the more references you can get, the better. and make sure you're not just getting, a text message back from a random number saying, yes, I know this person and they're good. Follow up the references, make sure that they look authentic, as well as calling them, call the references or the referees to make sure you can kind of validate and have that conversation. Other sorts of things you may want to look for is proof of affordability, and this can be provided in terms of potential contracts they have with employers or even bank statements. Proof of previous address is also useful. I also ask for a visa as well, even after they've got the kind of right to rent paperwork in place. So yeah, ultimately, the more the better. Take your time to reach out to the referees, as I say, and make sure you're comfortable with everything that's been provided to you. Um, Next stage then would be around the deposit setup. So getting towards the end now, this part can be super simple as long as you've already got account in place. So if you haven't, pick one of the government approved agencies. So DPS is the one that I've always used. I've not got a preference. I couldn't say which one is the best, but DPS is just the one I've always used. So that's always the one I recommend, rightly or wrongly. As I say, it has to be a government approved agent. So that's pretty simple just to check. Just again, leverage the old Google to make sure you do. And it's a relatively simple process. You will, if you set up a new account, generally you'll set up a few details around the properties and then the properties you own, and then you'll start assigning new deposit schemes to each of those properties. So every time you have a new tenant, they will be associated to the property portfolio, and you provide basic information around how much rent they're paying, the day that they provided the deposit, and then the rest of it's pretty straightforward. You send money, yeah, the funds or the deposit to DPS. Obviously, if you're going through the insured route, it's slightly different. You can hold the funds. But if you go for a traditional deposit holding, so you'll send the funds to DPS, they will then confirm receipt and send the deposit certificate to your tenant. So yeah, relatively simple process, but make sure you're doing that compliantly via an approved agent, as I say. And then the final bit, and potentially one of the most important bits, if you want to stay compliant, I think this is something that maybe I know definitely at the start of my landlord journey, I was not across the detail of. So I definitely recommend, yeah, putting these things in places. There's a plethora of information that you actually need to share with the tenant. Now, some of this is, I think, the government's way of kind of mitigating against landlords that essentially don't know what they're doing. So there's some standardized information that the government likes to provide to tenants, and they expect you as a landlord to do that. In the most part, I think some of this stuff I kind of have the conversation with the tenant about anyway. I also think some of this stuff the tenants generally don't understand nor care about. So it does feel like a bit of overkill in terms of the paperwork that you have to provide to the tenant. But nevertheless, these are the sorts of things that you have to provide. So first one, and that one that's important from the gov.uk's website is called the How to Rent Guide. So this document does get updated periodically. I think the most up-to-date version is October 2023. And essentially it's a checklist of things that tenants should be considering. So it's kind of a non-biased view from the government saying if you're taking over a new tenancy, you're taking over a lease or you're renting a room in your property, Mr. Tenant, this is the sorts of things that you should be considering, and here's some useful information about what your landlord should be doing. So it's a protection mechanism for the tenant and completely makes sense. But you as a landlord are expected to share that with the tenants so that they are well informed. Again, I just build this into my DocuSign application. So there's a few different DocuSign papers that I submit to the tenant throughout the life cycle of the agreement being set up. And one is almost like a data capture form, where I capture the information from them. And as part of that data capture form, I also send them this sorts of information around, in particular, the how to rent guide. So that's the period, that's the time frame that you want to send it to them, really. Next one is the EPC, the Energy Performance Certificate. So this should be sent, and primarily this is around showing that the property is in a compliant bracket. Obviously, and at the moment of this recording, A to E. Very soon, maybe an A to C or above. So yes, that EPC paperwork should be shared with the tenant as well. Gas safety certificate, also electrical safety report, also in addition to, and I have this built into the contract. And I would suggest most landlords do, but there should be information around how the tenant can contact you as well in case of emergency. So your name and your address. Um, so yeah, so that's it. That's how to set up a new tenancy agreement. Obviously, there's a lot of nuances that can take uh, that can happen in between you having your interaction with the tenant. In the most part, I always recommend if you in any part of the going back and forth with the tenant feel uncomfortable with either the information they're giving you or their reluctance to fill out certain pieces of information or even reluctance for them to accept certain piece of information that you're giving them, and then obviously just bear this in mind. You do in the most part want to have a tenant that you can trust and rely on. And I think this initial kind of pre-onboarding period as you're going through the tenancy agreement is the best time to kind of flesh that out. The amount of tenancy kind of setting up processes I've gone through where it's resulted in me not proceeding with the tenant is quite high. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think this kind of initial checks and governance is important to make sure that you are comfortable with letting the property out. It's not just about them being able to pay you the money. It's about making sure that you're compliant and they will be a worthwhile tenant to have in your property. So all worth considering.